0620. So pleased to have on the show former New York Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. You remember she won national acclaim and attention during the House Judiciary Committee hearings during Watergate. I sure remember it. She's out with a new book with journalist Cynthia Cooper called Cheating Justice: How Bush and Cheney Attacked the Rule of Law and Plotted to Avoid Prosecution and What We Can Do About It. Congresswoman, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with
it's
you
great
and your listeners.
Yes, I think when I was in college, I taped hours and hours and hours of the Judiciary Committee on my little tape recorder right off the TV, and I think I still have them.
Oh, my goodness. Well, don't listen to them again.
I sometimes I may go back and listen to you and Peter Rodino, but, that was it was a difficult time for the country, but in the end, a great time for our democracy. And that gets me right to your book here. Just lay out very basically the deception, the law-breaking that went on with Bush and Cheney, especially in light of the release of some secret torture documents in 2009.
Well, a lot more information has come out now since Bush has left office and Cheney left office. I have to say, just to start, that my obsession with presidential accountability and the rule of law did start with my being in Congress when we had to sit in judgment on President Nixon, and we did it in a fair and correct way, and we thought the rule of law triumphed. Well, here we are today, and as a former prosecutor, I was district attorney of Brooklyn, a separate city, be the fourth largest city in the country, prosecuted hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people for crimes. And for me, when a president commits a crime, or someone in a high position commits a crime, or a bank commits a crime, or bank officials commit crimes, they shouldn't be able to get away with it. There should be one standard of justice for everybody in this country. If you break the law, you've got to pay the price, or there has to be some accountability for it. And so I took a very close look as a former prosecutor. I was very pleased to have a former journalist and another lawyer work with me on this, Cynthia Cooper. And we looked at the various federal crimes that might have been broken, and we decided that the evidence is pretty substantial that it looks as though those crimes, these statutes were broken, and so we say there ought to be a special prosecutor, there ought to be a process of accountability. Now, I know as a prosecutor you don't find someone guilty, but you can't find someone guilty unless someone does an investigation and looks at the law, and there's ultimately a decision in a professional way as to whether or not to prosecute. What we looked at briefly were three areas. One were the lies and deceptions that got this country into the Iraq War, and we determined that there's one statute, even though there are a number of statutes that don't allow you to defraud Congress, there's really only one statute that would be available. In this case, it's called Conspiracy to Defraud the Congress. It's Section 371 of the United States Code. And some of the evidence about that really has to do with the fact that President Bush submitted to Congress a document saying that he had complied with the authorization to use force and therefore that he was entitled to bomb Iraq. But the authorization to use force required the president to certify that the attacks or the war military effort was against those who planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Well, we know completely now that Saddam Hussein did not plan, did not authorize, did not commit, or did not aid the terrorist attacks of 9/11.
And there's no way that the president could have certified that.
Correct. He knew that, and we know that he knew that wasn't true. And so under the federal statute 371, it's a conspiracy to defraud because he and the other members of his administration were also beating the drums for this war. We think that needs to be investigated. I won't go into all the details of that. There is a 5-year statute of limitations. We think that statute runs out in 2014, so there isn't really a lot of time. But we do a very careful analysis of that.
We're talking to former New York Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman. Her new book, Cheating Justice: How Bush and Cheney Attacked the Rule of Law, Plotted to Avoid Prosecution, and What We Can Do About It. I think our listeners know as well about authorizing torture, violating international treaty obligations. Since we're limited on time, Congresswoman, let me get to that part of the subtitle, Plotted to Avoid Prosecution.
Right.
Lay that out.
Okay, basically, with regard to mistreatment of detainees, there's no question that Bush and Cheney and Gonzales and a few other people at the very top were very worried about a U.S. statute called the War Crimes Act. They were worried from the get-go. They were worried as early as January 2002 that they could be prosecuted under the War Crimes Act, because the War Crimes Act says, in essence, that mistreatment of detainees in violation of the Geneva Accords is a federal crime. Mm-hmm. And if death results, there's a death penalty, which means there's no statute of limitations. And in a memo Gonzales wrote to President Bush, he said, if we opt out of Geneva Conventions, that will reduce the likelihood of prosecution under the War Crimes Act. So they knew that War Crimes Act was sitting right there and was a dagger aimed at their heart. So what did they do? So they opted out of Geneva Conventions, and they said the Geneva Conventions don't apply, and they thought, therefore, that the War Crimes Act wouldn't apply and they'd be safe. Well, the fact of the matter is the Supreme Court said that the Geneva Conventions do apply, and therefore to the detainees, and therefore once the Geneva Conventions applied, the War Crimes Act applied. Well, then they got really scared, because that meant they could be prosecuted under the War Crimes Act. And so they went and they persuaded Congress to change the War Crimes Act. They made it I don't think there's another example in the history of the United States. Mm-hmm. They made the War Crimes Act retroactively inoperable. Okay?
Yep.
So that meant they could not be prosecuted. And we parsed that War Crimes Act, and I don't think a prosecutor can prosecute under that act, but it would take a lot of ingenuity to do that. So what is left, so they took the War Crimes Act out of there, and that would have covered cruel treatment. There would have been no question about any definitions of cruelty. All of those actions would have been clearly covered. So they basically neutered the War Crimes Act without really explaining why they wanted to do it. And it wasn't telling the country. Basically, it was a kind of a pardon for themselves, which is an outrage.
Right.
Then the other thing they did with regard to torture was to create these legal memos that were going to get them, they thought, free from violating the Torture Act.
Right.
Well, it's like, this is the defense. Well, my lawyer told me I could do it.
Sure. And that lawyer's still one of them is still a professor.
Correct. And in any case, we went through the legal memos, which on the face are nonsense. And we believe that you can't tell a lawyer to give you a memo that's going to exonerate your actions, and that becomes a defense. Right. And we think that, by the way, there is under the Patriot Act certain kinds of torture there is no statute of limitations for. So these are the crimes of mistreatment, cruel and for severe infliction of pain and suffering. Can be prosecuted.
Congresswoman, can you stay for a few more minutes on the next
sure.
segment? There's several questions that are really important I'd love to ask you. If you
sure.
don't mind, I will love to have you stay. Our guest is former New York Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, co-author with Cynthia Cooper of Cheating Justice, How Bush and Cheney Attacked the Rule of Law, Plotted to Avoid Prosecution, and What We Can Do About It.